And welcome to another episode of today's Roundtable. Today, we're going to be talking about differences between working with beginner, intermediate, and advanced lifters. Um, so we'll kick things off. Let's go with Leanne. When we're working with beginner, intermediate, and advanced, what are some general things that you'd use to identify whether they're beginner, intermediate, advanced?
I think firstly is like, what is their background? So have they played sport before? How long have they been lifting for? Whether it's powerlifting specifically or just general fitness, which is like kind of the big one, which then leads on to kind of like, how much muscle mass have they developed? How technically efficient are they? And then it's kind of like a branch from there. So whether they've, if they've done powerlifting before, then, they might fall more so into that intermediate category. Whereas if they haven't, starting from right from the beginning, and then obviously like an elite level, it's they've been doing it for years and years. So they know themselves, they know what they're like as a lifter, that kind of thing. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the way that you can kind of differentiate one from the other when you're first starting with someone. And like I said, I guess if they've been doing it for a while, they're going to kind of know what they're like anyway. They're going to know what they're like as a lifter, and what they need. Whereas a beginner is someone who it's more so like trial and error from the start. Whereas even like an intermediate, they might kind of know themselves a little bit more as a lifter and what works for them, or yeah, that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's a good way to put it. And just to touch on that, like your your strength level does play a little bit of a role to it, but it's not hugely that important, which defines whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced, right? Like you could be a beginner and you're just starting out. However, if you've had like a prior level of sport and you've got like insane genetics, you might start off at a starting point that's like significantly higher than someone else, right? But it's relative to
Exactly.
yourself as an individual, where you are starting and then how you progress from there, which determines like beginner, intermediate, or advanced level.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll pass it to Dave. When we start working with these types of lifters, wherever they are in their journey, right? What are the general needs that you'd identify which with each category?
So this is a bit of a hard one, but um I think it also depends on the person, like most cases. So I think you've usually got two camps of people when you start with beginners. You've either got like the beginners that like undershoot everything. They don't really know like what hard training is yet. And that might be to a lack of experience in the gym, or like, their background, or just, a bunch of different things, right? Or you might have the other camp, which is like, the dudes or the girls that started off in the gym and just trained to failure all the time, and just went balls to the walls. And then you might have these two different scenarios where you have this beginner and you either have to teach them how to train hard by pushing them harder and, trying to get them to these higher RPEs, or vice versa, educating them on RPE and, teaching them how to leave reps in reserve, and, showing them that you can get stronger without emptying the tank on every single session. So I think that's generally the two sort of ways you get beginners, or at least in my experience, there's the two sort of phases of beginners that I see, and both sort of come back to just education, and then just meeting the client's needs and seeing, do they need to learn to train harder? Do they need to learn to chill out and just relax and stop going all out all the time? So that'd probably be the answer to that one for me.
Yeah, nice. Shania, do you want to add to that question as well?
Yeah, I would say similar to Dave. Like, I think like experience is it says it all. Like, it's dependent on like you could have someone that comes from a background of like playing sport, like they've worked with a coach before, they've trained before, but they could still come into powerlifting and be a novice because it's like that sport could be like a team sport where they're used to having like other people play on the field and it's like that team environment, whereas like powerlifting is very like individual, right? Like it's you in the bar, like it's you and like your mindset. And like, it's like, as David said, it's like how you, like educate and coach around getting them through each phase. But I would definitely agree. Like, I noticed that with like my athletes for sure, it's like they're either the ones that like overshoot or like undershoot or like don't know like how hard to like push or like when to pull back, is the biggest difference. And I find with mine too, it's like everything can be, if they're in like that beginner phase, it's like they're kind of getting a response to everything, like competitions, like we're getting a little bit more on the platform, you know, like we don't have to like the peak and taper side of things is a little bit different because they'll kind of like always get a little bit more on the platform from like that adrenaline like environment they're in general. And then it's like the transition phase of like they'll have a comp where something doesn't go right or they'll miss a lift that they thought that they would get quite easy, and you're like, okay, this is kind of like we're moving into the intermediate phase now where we kind of do have to either try that a little bit harder in training because like this is where we're at, because like you can't just get it on the platform from the taper now. So it's like the transitional phases I find is where like a lot of the education has to like come from too. But yeah, I think what Leanne and like David has said pretty much like covers like majority of it. I think it's very dependent. Like the experience to me is dependent one on like what was their sporting background. So like, was it like a team sport like basketball or football, or was it like gymnastics? Like I find like if it's like a team sport, it's entirely different because you're coming into a sport where it's like, it's very much just like you, and like, yes, you have a coach, but like you have to be able to get yourself through your training sessions. And then it's also like, what was that experience with that previous coach or all of their previous coaches? Like, was it positive or negative? And how is that influencing their relationship with you?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because like even as a beginner, right? Like say if we're boxing this into like beginners for just powerlifting, there's so much experience that you can draw from before coming in. But I think a lot of people, when they do first start powerlifting, that's also the first time they start like just general strength training. So sometimes like you might confound people like who've come into powerlifting as quote unquote beginners, but they've already got this experience of like weight training and resistance training. But if we're going from like the very, very beginning and like you need to start from the foundations, I think the biggest thing is like just teaching people the process of training and like adherence and all the behaviors with that. Because I think a big phase I see, like Dave said, like sometimes it might be two camps, and we might extend this to the very beginning where it's like people would just train for fun and therefore they'll go into a session and they'll just skip the rest of the week kind of thing. Like they don't have that full understanding of like, why do you need to train in the first place and how do you yield adaptations? Versus people who just go in, they start enjoying training and they'll train every day, right?
Yeah.
And then learning how to teach people like, yeah, you need to recover as well. So there's that huge aspect of just everything needs education. Like, but if you were to start somewhere, I think adherence and just doing enough is a very big need for a beginner. I think it gets a little more stereotypical as we progress, because like it's hard for us to like bring it down to one thing right now. But I would say like once you go from beginner to intermediate, like Shania pointed out, there's diminishing returns once you start making those newbie gains. And then you're going to have to either try harder or you're going to have to work smarter. And working smarter, like we said, might have to come onto the aspect of organizing your training so you're recovering, or like that's where you got to start having a bit more nuance in the program, right? Because you could do like 5x5 on every single day until it stops working. Right. And then I think once you get to advanced, that's where like everything needs to be on point on the athlete side of things, both recovery, training hard. And that's where it's like the program becomes the most important thing, I would say. Because sometimes that's where it's like you might get burned if you do too much. And you might be just spinning your wheels if you're doing too little, right? Because, Shania, did you want to add something on?
No, I was just going to say, like, I just got a thought in my head where I feel like it's just like, no matter, like, if we label people at a certain level, like beginner, intermediate, advanced, I feel like because powerlifting and strength training is so, like, it's always evolving and it's always changing, right? Like you just said, it's like you can run something until it doesn't work, or it's like you'll repeat a taper into a comp where it worked and then all of a sudden it doesn't. So it's like it's always growing and it's always evolving. And it's like I feel like no matter where we label someone, like an advanced or intermediate athlete can always almost go back to being a beginner when something doesn't work and you have to refine, either like the golden microcycle or, the perfect like sort of taper or peak. Like it's always evolving and changing. And it's like, even if you're, like an advanced or intermediate athlete who works with X coach for so many years and then, you're finding that something's not working and you go to a new coach who has like different processes and the way that they manage things and coach, it's like you can go from feeling like an absolute professional with your old coach to being like a complete beginner with your new coach, right? Like you're learning new things all the time. So I think that's kind of like a really like cool thing and like exciting thing about powerlifting is that like it is always evolving and changing. And when you feel like you're an advanced athlete, like there could be one thing that happens and then the next minute you're like, I got to relearn how to do all this again kind of thing, I guess.
100%. I agree. Even like from like beginner to intermediate, I feel like there needs to be that conversation where like, they might have been doing things one way for a very long time and they might think, you're intermediate, but it's like you're transitioning to say a new coach or a new style of training and like things are so different. It's like you have to relearn how to either lift or, not necessarily lift, but like you're learning different techniques or different ways of like styles of training. And it's like, yeah, being open to receiving that as well and not like being so super resistant to the change. Yeah, especially I find like with a lot of females who have done like a heap of sport in like previously, they just want to like go and it's like they just want to train all the time. And it's actually being able to like take a step back and realize that recovery is so important and they're actually going to get more out of it from recovering, taking days off. Yeah, that's something I've found I've had to educate quite a few of my athletes on.
Yeah,
especially in the intermediate phase.
Interesting.
Yeah,
let's start from the other end of the spectrum now, right? Because we've covered beginners. If we start from advanced lifters, where do you see the pitfalls lie in where they're making progress? Or like what's the thing that we feel like is stopping advanced athletes at that level from taking that next step and progressing? Dave, did you want to start on this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the biggest things is like it's kind of been I guess briefly touched on. You sort of mentioned it before where it's like you either get burned by doing too much or you spin your wheels by not doing enough. So I think a lot of it can come from how they became advanced in the first place. So if they went through the sort of beginner and intermediate phase, just training really hard, like it was just pure grunt work, the program didn't really matter that much. They were always going to get stronger just because they trained so hard. And they take that mentality into their advanced stage where now it matters more if you overshoot. It matters more if you do too much work because the fatigue from being that strong and handling those kinds of loads takes its toll, and you have to be smarter with the one percenters. So managing all the external stuff, your recovery has to be on point. Load selections are less forgiving if you just tend to take a little bit too much or if you're not doing as much. So I think that's probably the biggest one is like not reflecting on where they're currently at and then possibly just being like, okay, how I got here got me to where I am, but to get even further, I might have to take a different approach. I might have to sort of recalibrate myself as a lifter and change what I'm doing to continue to move forward. And that could be the program, that could be training attitudes or mentalities, or, it could be a bunch of different things. But I think that sort of distinction of like what I've done in the past may no longer work for me is a pretty big sort of like self-realization that has to happen for you to continue to progress.
Yeah, I think touching upon that, like if you're at an advanced level of training, both like you've been able to yield a lot of progress for yourself and you've been training for a long time, like that says things about like the kind of dedication and resilience you have already, right? Just personality wise. So I think that ticks things off already. And like you said, that's where you need to start being a bit more critical about what you're actually doing, because once you get to that point, like the percentage of gain is just so small. Like you're only going to be gaining so much more muscle mass after a certain point. Technical proficiency might have already been maxed out. So I think like at a advanced point, right, it doesn't really extend further of like finding an extra key or things like that. It's balancing, making really, really small adjustments as you go to like problem solve through things. But at the same time, balancing it with giving it enough time to come to fruition, right? And to take it to say an intermediate level, I think a big pitfall once you get to the intermediate stage is like you've realized that now you need to start training harder or something needs to change because what you're doing in the past worked as a beginner because everything works. And now you realize, oh, I need to change, right? And a mental pitfall I think that might happen is like you start changing too much. That's where you start seeing people like jumping programs, never giving it enough time. And then you're just stuck there for like until you can just realize that's where you need to give it time. So I think being impatient is a very big like pitfall of intermediate lifters. Shania,
Yeah,
did you want to touch on intermediate as well? So you can go as well, Dave.
Oh, I was just gonna chime in and say like I'm gonna get this wrong most likely, but you know Joe O'Sullivan?
Yep.
Yeah, the American lifter. I think he added like I want to say it was like 7 kilos to his total in like 10 years or something of training, just because he's hit that point of like he's so strong and he's been in the game for so long, and it's like you just have to be patient sometimes to get stronger. And I think he's a really, really good example of someone that's just stayed in the game and just keeps working and keeps getting stronger. So I
Yeah.
just want to throw that in.
It's just like getting comfortable with like, I guess the how we determine progress and like the rate of progress, I guess potentially like slowing down or being less compared to when you're a beginner, right? Like that's what happens as you get stronger. But I think like the intermediate and like advanced like stages, I guess if we look at like competitions, like when you're a beginner, it's like you want to get into as many comps as you can. You want to experience the platform. You just want to have fun. Like, you know, I guess like Sydney's a perfect example. Like you guys are like, I feel like running competition every weekend. Like there's like, you know what I mean? And like there's like so many novice beginner lifters that are just like competing all the time. But it's like when you hit that advanced stage, like whatever it might be, like if it's world, it's like the comps you are doing, you're doing them for a reason. So it's like the frequency that you're getting on the platform to either like experience it or practice the things that you know you need to practice on the platform and be around, you know, certain levels of reps. It's like that becomes less and less, right? So the more that you're not identifying and be able to switch on and know what works for you in training, because it becomes a point where like training is obviously happening more frequently. It's happening, you know, 4 or 5 days a week, every week of the year. If you're not doing that and you're not doing what you know you need to do in those sessions, then you're not going to execute on that platform. So it's like everything that you do in training has to be that little bit more like mentally switched on, which at the end of the day does become a lot more mentally draining, right? Competitions, it's like you're doing all the hard work into that comp, and then it's like managing yourself post comp to kind of be able to keep going, whatever it looks like. So it's like knowing when to push and pull back for that like more advanced intermediate stage, so that it's not like we're trying to just push through a period of like where we're potentially not feeling like motivated, and then it's like we burn out before we even reach that big comp or that big goal, whatever it might be. So I think the difference for like, yeah, intermediates for advanced is knowing what it is that you need in that moment and being able to like do it yourself rather than rely on the environment to bring it for you as well. Like that's a big thing, I think. Like if you're an advanced or an intermediate athlete who potentially still doesn't know like what you need from like an arousal sense, or like how to increase and decrease that and manage it and have it come in waves throughout a session, you're probably only going to burn yourself out more. And then that's just going to kind of create this feeling of like either chasing your tail every session or chasing loads every week because you need to be at a certain point, like within a block of training. And then, I mean, me being me, like another difference is nutrition for sure. Like advanced and intermediate, like external to programming, like if you're not doing nutrition and it's not a priority for you, it'll become very hard to kind of go any further, I think.
Yeah. I wanna take it to that first point you brought up. And I think that was a very insightful way of putting it, right? Like just frequency of competitions as a beginner, like 3 or 4 times, or maybe even 5 times a year, you're practicing being on a platform. So like you don't really have to think about it that much in training, because you know in 2 months' time you're going to be on the platform again, right? And that's where you get to try something that's new for you in terms of arousal, things like that. Whereas, like you said, as you get intermediate, advanced, and you're forced to only compete like twice a year, I think that's a good point where maybe that's a natural progression of why lifters start getting a bit more serious in training, and that's why burnout happens. Just because you realize what's at stake with each training session, because each one's more meaningful, because you're not going to get those opportunities on the platform. So I just thought that was a really insightful way of putting it.
Yeah.
I think like touching upon that as well, like with beginners, the biggest thing I find is probably just attrition rate, or like just dropping out of powerlifting, or just quitting training altogether. Things along those lines, because at that point, like gains are literally free. Compared to someone who's an advanced lifter, all you need to do is show up to train. You don't even have to have a certain attitude to it. You just need to do what's on the program and progress a little bit. And even when you just rock up to the gym, it's likely that your body will have adapted and you can automatically just add kilos to the bar. It's just like being a human is where it becomes the barrier, right? Like you've got things going on. You don't want to go into the gym and you're believing that belief. I think that's where beginners will end up getting stuck as beginners as well, right? Like it's very,
Yeah.
it's what's the word? Like it's hard to say, because like I don't work with that many lifters that do get stuck as a beginner, because I would say it's hard to stay a beginner. Essentially, like if you're working with a coach, like that's very rarely going to happen, right? But for people that like don't have a coach and you're really just starting, like that's the thing that you need to work on, that'll push you further into intermediate stage.
Mm.
Well,
But
yeah, and it's also just like, oh, sorry, it's also just like external, internal motivation, like right, like intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. Like, you know, you hear a lot of like comments, like I guess like beginners who say like, oh, I do so much better on comps because like the environment and the vibe and everyone's around me, and you know, they get more on the platform because it's like external motivation. So again, like those transition and those phases between beginner, intermediate to advanced is like the advanced athletes are the ones that could like go into the gym, have nobody there, like, or like, you know, have no training environment, no spotters and loaders, and have to just hit a load because they have to. Whereas like other people that struggle with it, like that's the learning curves you have to go through. So it's like, how do you like, yes, use the training environment where you need to, but you also need to know that you can perform at that same level by yourself.
yeah. Did you want to touch in on something, Leanne?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say as well, like the transition from a beginner to intermediate, like actually just focusing more on the externals. So like, you know, sleep, like Shania said, nutrition, like is so important. And that those little things will take you to that next level. It's important at all levels, but it's like that transition, because from a beginner, like it's so easy, and you can, like you said, you can just rock up and, you know, hit PRs pretty much every session. But then it's like once that starts to slow down, what do you need to do maybe outside of the gym that's going to help you inside the gym? Yeah, which is a conversation again, between like the coach and the athlete, I think. Yeah.
We'll finish things off with one more topic. We'll relate it to programming, and I know it's going to be very general, just because we don't have any cases to like look at someone's progression from beginner to advanced. But what are some general programming ideas when it comes to working with beginner, intermediate, advanced? We'll go with Dave.
Sure. I typically like to start beginners with lower amounts of frequency, specificity, volume, those sorts of things, and just try and get like the most we can out of as little as we can, just so that when we start hitting into the more intermediate phase, or as they get stronger, we have like so many cards in the deck that we can just pull out to start milking more progression and just try and drag things out for as long as we can. So focusing more on like building muscle as a beginner, because that's going to serve you really, really well as you get further into the powerlifting stuff. And as you progress, right, it's more natural and more of a I guess more of a necessity to become more specific with your sort of adaptations as you become more intermediate and advanced. So spending the time on having the freedom to have some variability and, you know, do a lot of bodybuilding work and doing a lot of I guess non-specific stuff, so that by the time you have to, you know, pull out this 2 or 3 times a week comp squat or whatever, you've got the muscle mass to support this, and you don't have to go away from that to be like, man, like I'm comp squatting 3 times a week right now, but like my quads are just so small, I'm gonna have to take some time to go and rebuild them, when you should have just done that in the first place and just sort of set yourself up for success by, you know, doing these small sorts of things of like, you know, actually building some muscle mass while you're a newer lifter. So those sorts of things are some like big sort of things that I try and take into account, is just like not showing your hand too early and not playing the highly specific programming too early, and then just leaving yourself room to increase specificity, volume, frequency, all those sorts of things as necessary phases.
Yeah. So I was cutting out a little bit, but I think we got the gist of it, where you're trying to keep things as unspecific as possible and have like a general approach to things, just so then when in the future you do need those things, it'll be available and you can still milk that out.
Yeah, essentially, just getting by.
Yeah. Shania, did you want to touch on like what you think about for, let's go through phases. So like once you've hit that beginner stage, the gains have like milked out, what kind of things do you look out for when you're progressing into intermediate?
So I guess progressing into intermediate could look like, I guess like removing some of the like bodybuilder accessory stuff and having, or like where the accessories become more of like those non-negotiable or like movement constraints as well. Like keeping some of them in there just for like enjoyment as well, but accessories will obviously slightly change. You know, they might become more individualized to like, again, like what the client needs. If we're trying to like set them up for a specific lift, things like that. I also find that like I'll probably run like the same sort of micro for a fairly like long period of time, or like solid few blocks, even if it's like, if I can like into a competition, however long that might be, until, like I've said at a few roundtables now, where it's like until some sort of breakdown occurs somewhere. So like whether, you know, top end sort of starts like stop showing up, and then that's where I'll either look at, depending on like what the frequency of a lift someone's doing, whether it's like I add or remove it depending where we sort of started at, or like manipulating or changing sort of like the rep ranges and those sort of like sets, volume, variables like that. So that'll kind of be like beginner to intermediate, and then just assessing where it goes. Because I think once you run that sort of beginner period for, you know, however long each coach wants to run it for, you sort of have an idea of how strong they got. So when you either add or remove something, it'll give you that information on whether they either needed it or they didn't need it. And then you can kind of, again, change and manipulate from there.
Yeah. Good way of putting it. I think like for a lot of people, you end up doing that anyways as you get to advanced, right?
Yeah.
On top of that, did you want to add more to that as well, Leanne? And then you can also transition into advanced as well.
Yeah, I think as well, like just looking at the layout of the program. So I guess at a beginner stage, you might, you know, go in and train whenever, you know, works around your schedule. Whereas like at an intermediate and advanced level, it's like setting out specific training days actually allows you to have repeatable recovery week to week, so that you can go into the sessions kind of knowing exactly how you're going to feel and perform. So I think that's a big one. And then also like just like literally looking at the whole layout of the program itself, like the accessories and things. How is fatigue kind of carrying through the week, and are we feeling strong on the primary days? Because that's, I guess, the goal is like to feel strong on your primaries, and are the like secondary and tertiary days setting you up to feel like that? And then if we transition into like the advanced, it's also just looking at like staying healthy. So being able to continually train and having accessories put in there, not so much, I guess, like you've said before, because you've already pretty much maxed out your like muscle bulk. It's like being able to have accessories in there to maintain like certain ranges, range of motions, to maintain staying healthy and not get injured all the time, I think is a big one at the advanced level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good way of putting it. And like that's where you see people start doing like quote unquote weirder exercises, like all this unilateral stuff. Because like as a intermediate, there's no reason why you should do that. You're still focusing on like building muscle mass and things like that. And then as you start getting more advanced, it's like you're just doing a very culled down program. Like you're doing SBD, and then you've got some sort of like unilateral work to kind of work on like imbalances, right? And it looks like
Yeah, sure.
The evolution of someone's program might look like you've got everything in there, then it becomes like less and less until it's just like SBD at one point. Once you get to like super advanced level,
even more boring.
yeah. I think like there's more of a stress on like needing structure when you get to more advanced, just because like you understand if you miss a day or you push a day back or forward, that's going to influence the rest of the week. And what Leanne said, like you could work training around your lifestyle when you're a beginner, and then as you start getting more advanced, it gets to the point where it's like your lifestyle needs to fit around your training, just because it requires that much effort to make adaptations at that point, where it's like there becomes a conversation of like how advanced do you want to be, right? And I think the limiting factor just becomes it becomes like just commitment outside of training that becomes like the limiting factor, right? So I think programming wise, like you need to ensure that you're not wasting time in as you get more advanced, right? Because like Dave touched on, as a beginner, like muscle mass is probably already maxed out for an advanced lifter. Like maybe you could put accessories that'll fill the frame that's not related to powerlifting, but that's sort of considered a waste of time. So it's spent more trying to just get the main lift stronger at that point, right? Like you don't need variability unless it's for the sake of keeping range of motion deficits. And even then, like you're no longer doing things such as like, for example, like shoulder press. Instead, you're doing something that's more like unilateral based if you're looking to milk out specifically just keeping range of motion, right? So exercise selection becomes very, very nuanced, and you need someone who's always going to program and have a more detailed understanding of biomechanics as well, right? Because I think a lot of like anyone can coach a beginner and get them strong. And then once you get to advance and you run to a roadblock, such as like injury or something just constantly keeps getting hurt, that's where you need like at least some sort of understanding of biomechanics or functional anatomy to help select exercises and get you through that.
For sure.
The last thing I would say, like again, tying it back to like nutrition, is also like weight classes too, obviously. Like I think with beginner and intermediates, like I know obviously here at Perth, like we're big on like as individual coaches, like I guess any beginner intermediate clients that we have, it's like putting them into like sort of the next weight class up, because it's the most like it's the best avenue for them to make progress and enjoy the sport versus like I guess capping them really early on. And then that's obviously potentially something that like advanced athletes are like wary of or like conscious of, is that how far capped are they in their weight class in terms of like how lean are they, like how much room do we actually have to move. Like there's so many more variables like with nutrition, the more advanced you get, that you have to be aware of. And then it's like it can come down to a question of, does an advanced athlete have to move up to continue getting stronger and make progress, or like, you know, are there niggles and injuries that are coming out more frequently, and is that because of, you know, nutritional like factors, recoverability, all those kind of things too. So I think that's again just like an external thing to programming that is like needs to be like I guess like thought about and taken into consideration too.
Yeah. And like I think that the aim of the goal is always to just get stronger, right? Like I think when you're advance, like you could get stuck trying to be competitive in a weight class for so long that's like that's where you start running into those issues. Whereas a beginner, they don't care. They're just gonna keep trying to put on muscle mass and just keep getting stronger.
Yeah.
But you could also argue if you're a beginner trying to just start powerlifting, you might lock yourself into like whatever you're sitting at right there with no muscle mass. So that could be like a huge pitfall, which I'd recommend. Like if you're a beginner and you're just starting powerlifting, like don't even think about weight classes. Just put on muscle, just keep getting stronger and just see where your body ends up sitting at once you have filled out your frame.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that'll wrap things up for today's chat. Thanks for jumping on, guys, and we'll see you all in the next roundtable. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Danny.
Thanks.